Hey everyone, after a long hiatus I'm back, and unsurprisingly I'm sure the topic I want to address today is the recent white supremacist massacre of 9 African American parishioners at a historic black church in Charleston, South Carolina. There are a lot of different angles from which one can approach this horrific atrocity. There are a number of things that could be said about it. Frankly, I just alluded to one of those things. I made a point of calling it an atrocity rather than a tragedy. That's not to say that what happened to those 9 people and the suffering and bereavement that their loved ones have to endure for the rest of their lives is not tragic. Obviously, it is. It goes without saying that the situation is tragic. But I tend to try to avoid using the word tragedy to describe these kinds of horrific acts because it makes it sound as if this is something that just happened on its own, sort of like an act of God or a freak accident. A tragedy, to my way of thinking, carries an impersonal connotation, as if you're referring to a natural disaster or something of that nature. Obviously, this massacre did not just happen. Someone did it. Dylann Roof did it. And of course, I want to use a term that I think more comprehensively captures the horrific and evil nature of what he's done. So I'd prefer to use the word atrocity or similar terms to describe this act and other acts like it, rather than a more anodyne term like tragedy. What's more, I think it's good that a number of people are commenting on this issue by framing it as an act of terrorism. I think terrorism is exactly what it was. The fact that a lone gunman carried it out, and the fact that so far no evidence has yet emerged to indicate that he had any help, I don't think those facts change the reality that this was an act of terrorism. White supremacist terrorism, but of course terrorism nonetheless. The fact that the perpetrator carried this out for fundamentally political reasons, such as his belief in white supremacy and in the inferiority of blacks, that makes this act of murder, obviously targeted deliberately against civilians, an act of terrorism. And so I'm glad to see that many commentators have been willing to come out and characterize it as such as well, in addition to characterizing it as a hate crime, which it is as a matter of fact, if not necessarily as a matter of law, under South Carolina law at least. But there's another dimension to this that I want to give a bit more attention. I understand from CNN that the magistrate judge, the county magistrate in Charleston, the judge who has overseen the legal proceedings in this case so far, actually went out of his way to admonish everyone involved in the case, everyone in the courtroom, and everyone watching on TV, that we need to show forgiveness and compassion for the family of the perpetrator, or alleged perpetrator, as well as for the loved ones who were left behind by the victims. He went into a bit of a lecture, if you ask me, telling everyone that no one would have wished this kind of fate on Dylann Roof's family, and that they need our compassion and our forgiveness as much or almost as much as the bereaved folks in Charleston, South Carolina do. I have to say I disagree. I'm not saying that well, let me qualify my statement. I think we don't know yet just how much forgiveness and sympathy Dylann Roof's family really deserves. I don't think we know yet enough yet about him or his background or his upbringing to be able to say whether we really should show any sympathy for his family or not. His family has put out a sympathetic message expressing their condolences to the victims, and that was certainly the decent thing to do. But I wonder, Dylann Roof is 21 years old. I don't know whether he was living on his own at the time that he carried out this massacre, or whether he was still living at home with his family. But if he's 21 years old, then chances are, even if he's living on his own, he hasn't been living on his own for that long. It seems very likely that not that long ago he was still living at home with his folks. Now, I'm not saying that his folks necessarily planted these hateful white supremacist ideas in his mind. I'm not necessarily saying that they raised him with those kinds of values. I'm not saying that they should have anticipated that he might do something like this. But I do think that there's a question that's worth asking here. Did they really not have any inkling at all that their son was harboring these noxious ideas and was willing to take them so far as to act on them, even if they couldn't have seen a massacre like this coming. I think it's worth asking whether his folks really didn't have any idea at all that he was formulating these grotesque, warped opinions. I mean, consider the testimony, well, I shouldn't say testimony, but the claims of his friend, whose last name I think is Meek. I forget his first name. He's actually commented on in the news media about racist jokes and other racist remarks that Dylann Roof made in the past. In his presence, he says he himself got into arguments with Dylann Roof about his views on these issues of race relations. And I think at one point he even stole Dylann Roof's gun out of his car because he was afraid of what he might do with it, only to later return the gun to him because he didn't want to get in trouble with the law for, stealing the young man's property. So if his friend was at least aware that he was harboring these grotesque racist views, I think it's really worth asking whether there's nothing that his parents could have done, at least to find out that he had developed these twisted ideas. And I mean, this isn't just someone who, goes on YouTube videos and posts racist remarks anonymously. I mean, this kid took a gun, walked into a church, specifically targeted that church, as we now know, because of its status as a historic African-American church, and gunned down 9 people in cold blood simply because of the color of their skin. I mean, it doesn't get any more extreme than that. How could he really have developed that degree and kind of hatred in his heart at such a young age, no less, without anyone in his family having any idea about it? It's possible. I'm not saying for sure that they knew what he believed and did nothing. But I am saying that for all we know at this point, at this early stage, they might have acted negligently, carelessly, or at least complacently in their reactions to the ideas that their son had acquired and developed. It's possible he never expressed any of these views in the presence of his family members, but still, given how little we know at this point, I think it's fair to ask the question, was there really nothing they could have done? And even if there was nothing they could have done to prevent this particular act on his part, I think it's still fair to ask, how were they raising this young man? Did they not raise him to treat people of different backgrounds with respect and tolerance? Did they not raise him with at least some values that would hopefully have made him less susceptible to these white supremacist blandishments to which he was clearly exposed at some point along the line, in which he just imbibed whole cloth? Was there really nothing they could have done in terms of the way they raised him to make him more resistant to these ideas? At the very least, I think those questions need to be answered before we show any kind of sympathy for this young man's family. I'm not saying that they're not going through their own special kind of hell and torment right now, but what I am saying is we don't know yet that they don't deserve it. We don't know yet that they do deserve it. But until we hear more about that, I think that what that judge said in that courtroom was totally inappropriate, not only at this juncture, but at any juncture. At least until we know more about how Dylann Roof's family raised him, about the kinds of values that they tried to instill and inculcate in him. Until we know more about that, I think they can do without the sympathy of the general public. Now, I understand the bereaved families of the victims in South Carolina, in Charleston, have pretty much unanimously expressed forgiveness for Dylann Roof himself, let alone his family. That's their business. They have every right to do that. I would never dream of telling people in their position how to respond to a tragedy and a loss such as this. They have every right to show the perpetrator and his loved ones as much or as little forgiveness and sympathy as they want. But that's them. For someone in my position and for the rest of us in the general public, I think there's some tough questions that need to be answered about how this young man was raised before we are under any kind of obligation to show any kind of sympathy or compassion or forgiveness for his family, now or ever. And of course, I agree with all the sentiments that are being expressed throughout the media, both old and new, about the role of the politics of white supremacy in motivating Dylann Roof to carry out this horrific, grotesque terrorist attack. And you know, definitely this is just one more piece of evidence in the mountain of evidence that already exists to disprove the notion that America is some kind of post-racial society nowadays in which racism is trivial or doesn't matter anymore. Clearly, it is still a very real problem, a very real threat, and even as we now can see, an existential threat to many people, non-white people, and their sympathizers in American society even today. And obviously that desperately needs to be dealt with. So, you know, these are just my 2 cents, just some thoughts that I wanted to inject into the debate and the discourse surrounding this horrific tragedy. Of course, ultimately the most important message to send is to condemn this disgusting act and to express my sympathy for the families who are bereaved by it, and to keep them in my thoughts and my prayers. The struggle continues. Signing off.